Want to ask about something very famous about education, that is about critical pedagogy, that was introduced by Paulo Freire from Brazil. In the point of view, now I'm with Dr. Ahmar Mahboob, the professor of Nomad.
Prof. Nomad.
Prof. Nomad, yeah. He's also called Sunny
Boy.
Sunny Boy, yeah. Okay, Sunny Boy, what's your opinion about critical pedagogy introduced by Paulo Freire? I heard that you have visited Brazil and saw some practices in the education there, and also the effectiveness of the education.
It's a very good question. It's a very tough question to actually work with. I've been to Brazil a couple of times, and I've had the opportunity to visit a number of the schools, including indigenous schools. So very privileged in being able to do that. Now, one of the things I observed that their books, their educational resources, are very much based on critical theory, right? So they're very well designed from a critical perspective. At the same time, I see massive oppression, massive poverty.
Still there.
Right? Massive crime.
In Brazil?
In Brazil, right? So you have poverty, you have crime, you have huge numbers of social and environmental problems. So my question then becomes, how does the teaching or adoption of critical theory within educational paradigms actually impact the social environmental outcomes?
Yes, yes.
So if socio-economic and environmental problems are not addressed through a critical pedagogy, then the pedagogy isn't doing the work it should be doing.
Yeah.
So the ideas are brilliant, but they don't translate into practice. Right? So that's where credible approach is important. So
I want to know from a credible approach point of view about that.
So
yes.
the whole idea then is, let's not worry about the criticality of things or the power relationships. Yes, those things exist. Let's think about how to create resources and alternatives that will address the problems. What can we do to create new economies through which poverty will be reduced?
Yep.
Right? How do you actually do it? Talking about it doesn't do it. Creating projects and resources and economies doesn't. So that's the whole purpose of the credible approach. And it draws on what we call positive discourse analysis, which is kind of opposite of critical discourse analysis. Right? So in critical discourse analysis, people are trained to understand how power relationships are construed, right, in various different areas, and how we can use a study of language to study the power distribution in communities. Right? Yes, it's a study, it's a research. I've done it myself 1,000 times. All it does, it leaves me frustrated. I know the problems. I can see how these problems are reflected in language. I can even see how some of these problems are created through language, discursively, but it changes nothing. So all it leads me is frustration, and I get upset, my blood pressure rises, I get angry, I get upset, all these things. Because I know the problems, but I can't do anything to change it. So I've been spending all this time doing research which takes you nowhere, other than leaving you frustrated. Just then we can talk about these things, but that's all we're doing. Right, so what we do instead is what I talk about is positive discourse analysis, which is very important to do credible projects. Essentially, the broad idea of...
Sorry,
yes.
I need to let the audience know that credible project is a name of project, a name of theory introduced by Dr. Ahmar Mahboob. Credible, CR until finish. There is a very clear explanation in his paper, Credible Project by Dr. Ahmar Mahboob. Please continue.
Yes, so credible projects are essentially projects that are designed to address real world issues by creating resources, by creating new economies, by creating new systems, by doing things, by creating alternatives and new things in order to address the problems that we find in our community. Now to do that, we engage, instead of doing CDA, we use positive discourse analysis. And
So PDA.
PDA, positive discourse analysis. And in very broad terms, positive discourse analysis is looking at successful models and examples of things that work. So, for example, we were talking about sugar consumption earlier.
Yep.
So, if we want to create resources and material to decrease the use of sugar in communities, then one of the projects that we can look at is the anti-tobacco campaign, for example, in Australia. So the anti-tobacco campaign in Australia has been quite successful. We know it's been successful because the rate of smoking is reducing. The number of teenagers who start smoking is less than it used to be.
Yes.
So by looking at the outcomes, we know that the Australian anti-tobacco campaign has been quite successful. So we can then study the Australian campaign to see how they generated, how were they successful, how did they get their success, what strategies did they use, what were the ways in which they did number of things to reduce the rate of smoking, and by learning it, we then can create our own material. So positive discourse analysis,
for
sugar, for example.
to reduce the consumption of sugar and carbohydrate.
Yes. So we're doing that by using positive discourse analysis. So positive discourse analysis means discourse analysis of things that are positive, that have been successful, things that have made a difference, things that are effective. By studying things that are effective, we can learn to do things which will be effective. Right? That helps us to create the resources and address the problems, as opposed to CDA, critical discourse analysis, that only leaves us frustrated.
Yeah. Interesting. A little bit more. Now, what's your opinion about this? Is what is it? A bit older theory that is about progressivism.
I avoid all these terms really. It's easy to label things all the time. I often tell people naming is a very political act.
Yes.
We often don't realize how political it is, because by creating names of things, of theories and
We
things,
simplify it.
we simplify it, but we also make something exist.
Okay.
Right?
Yes.
Right? So for example, let's think about, we're talking about Islamic universities earlier. So let's say Islam was a practice. It was a practice of integrity, of honesty. Right? So that was what Islam was. It was honesty. You practice integrity. Right? That is the principle of Islam. Right? So for example, Prophet Muhammad was known as Amin. Right? Which means somebody who can be trusted. Trustworthy. Being trustworthy was a practice. These are practices. So religion used to be practice. Now it's no longer a practice, because we give it a name and we turn it into a theory. So you believe in the theory, but you don't have a practice.
And it will be kind of, what is it? It will change into a new concept.
Absolutely, because it becomes named. So once you nominalize something, once you create it into an entity, then the entity can be studied into all these systems, all these different approaches, but what goes away is the practice.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmar Mahboob. Again, this is with me, Ikhsanudin, program S2 Pendidikan Bahasa Inggris Universitas Tanjungpura, and it is sponsored by UPT Bahasa Universitas Tanjungpura. The director is here, Ibu Stella Francisca. The camera is with Ana Vergina, the director of finance of UPT Bahasa Universitas Tanjungpura, Pontianak, Indonesia. Here at the University of Sydney, Australia.